Welcome to the latest instalment of Close Readings, and this is a slightly special one as we are embarking today on a brand new series of conversations. In this series we're going to consider some of the great narrative poems that have been written in English, poems that set out to tell a story from the Renaissance to the present day. My name is Seamus Perry and I teach English at Balliol College in Oxford, and as always I'm talking to Mark Ford, poet, critic and Professor of English at University College, London. Well, poems have traditionally always told stories, among all the other things that they do. Homer, Virgil, Ovid, Dante, Boccaccio, Chaucer. These poets are unimaginable without thinking about the stories and the tales that they tell. Mark and I don't have a grand historical thesis to put forward in these talks, I think, but we thought it would be a good idea to proceed chronologically, which, among other things, would allow us to consider how poetry has responded to what must be the greatest genre challenge it has faced in the last 300 or 400 years, which is to say, the rise of the novel. How do poems continue to tell stories when there is something else in the literary world that seems designed to do nothing but tell stories brilliantly well? But that is a subject for later programmes. We start today with a poem that emerges long before the novel has even been dreamt of. Hero and Leander by Christopher Marlowe, a reworking of a sorry tale of classical myth first published in 1598. And perhaps we should start, Mark, by saying something about what you might call the media presence of its author. What would have struck someone browsing in the stationer's shop in late Elizabethan England and coming across a small book entitled Hero and Leander by Christopher Marlowe? Because for one thing, like Kurt Cobain or Michael Hutchence, he was rather sensationally dead, wasn't he?
He'd been dead 5 years by the time it came out, and it has emerged over the centuries that his death was probably, in all probability, a murder sanctioned by the highest strata of the state, that he was deliberately done away with in this famous brawl in Deptford. It probably wasn't a brawl at all. It was probably three people who had agreed that they were going to murder him, and the whole thing was set up because it was known that he was the best known writer of the time, that Tamburlaine had been an unbelievable success, and was quoted often, including by Shakespeare in Henry IV Part 1. And he had rock star kind of presence, because he was a bad boy in many ways. He was like Caravaggio, I suppose, or Byron or Arthur Rimbaud, that he was one of those poets who lived on the edge. And living on the edge was, for him, was not just writing these sensational plays, which in some ways do look like adverts for atheism, or have a certain kind of remorseless amorality about them. And Dr. Faustus in particular was a play which seems, although Faustus is punished at the end, can be seen as a very transgressive play. And we'll notice in this poem there are references to Prometheus, who was a kind of famous transgressor from history. But he was also famous, well, as there's a note by someone called Richard Baines, which was set down by one of Francis Walsingham's kind of spies. And Marlowe, we should say, was also involved in the spy network. But in terms of Marlowe's world vision, he really sums it up and says in the phrase that all they that love not tobacco and boys were fools. He also says that St. John the Evangelist was bedfellow to Christ and leaned always in his bosom, that he used him as the sinners of Sodoma, that the woman of Samaria and her sisters were whores, and that Christ knew them dishonestly. So the vision of Christianity, which Protestant Elizabethans like Francis Walsingham were attempting to promote, was utterly undermined by a figure such as Marlowe, though Marlowe himself, it seems fairly clear, was did submit reports on Catholic conspiracies, which he's had infiltrated himself. So he was playing it both ways. And it wasn't that unusual to be a poet and a spy at those times. And one of the most disreputable events in Marlowe's life was when he and Thomas Watson seemed to have conspired to kill someone called Bradley in a brawl in 1589. So to get a sense of Marlowe as a bad boy living on the edge, I think is wholly appropriate. And it's worth saying that he grew up in absolute poverty. His father was a shoemaker, but because he was clever and he went to King's School in Canterbury and then on to Cambridge, where he spent 6 years. He was immensely learned, and Hero and Leander is based on classical sources.
Yes, so it's based on a poem by the Greek poet Musaeus, isn't it? Either directly upon the Greek or upon a later version of it. But we should say, I suppose, before anything else, that if our readers go away and look it up online, they're likely to find a poem that exists in 6 big books, each called a sestiad, because Marlowe's little stump poem has been completed by a contemporary of his called Chapman. What's our advice to our readers about what they do with Chapman's continuation of this poem?
Well, you don't have to read it, is my advice, in that, the sestiad is by analogy with the Iliad.
Yeah.
So this poem takes place in Sestos. So the idea was that it would somehow have an epic scope in Chapman's reworking of it. But Marlowe's poem is very much not an epic. It's Ovidian. It's inspired by Ovid, and Ovid, in many ways, was an anti-epic poet. Though it may be he wrote something called Medusa, which has disappeared, which was his attempt to write something of a more kind of extreme and dignified nature. But that Hero and Leander is probably the most purely Ovidian poem in the language, I would say, in that it's a transmutation of Ovid's wit and sophistication and love of elaborate imagery and its eroticism as well, and that Marlowe had translated Ovid's elegies or amores, including number 213, which has a reference to Hero and Leander in it, and Ovid was a poet who avoids the grand and the grave, and that he is very, very funny and brilliant, also rather cynical, you might say, or sophisticated, and that Marlowe is channeling all that in his version of Hero and Leander. And of course, Ovid had also written 2 epistles, one from Leander to Hero, one from Hero to Leander, in the Heroides, the numbers 18 and 19, I think. So he is very deliberately positioning himself as the inheritor of Ovid, who was probably the most influential of the classical poets for the Elizabethans.
Certainly a huge influence on Shakespeare, wasn't he? I think, yes, that's right.
Yes, and some of our listeners may have come across Hero and Leander through the references, through footnotes in As You Like It. If they ever studied that particular play, we'll come on to those references to the dead shepherd, as Shakespeare calls him. But Shakespeare references Hero and Leander in one of the most famous speeches in the play as well.
Yeah. So it's not an epic, and just so our listeners can carry away this important little piece of literary scholarly trivia, it's actually called an epyllion, isn't it? Which is like a little shortish, so a few hundred lines, a classical narrative poem, an account of a mythical episode, but not the full-blown epic treatment, and that's what Marlowe is going for. So the fact that Marlowe's bit of the poem, which ends in the 6-book version at the end of book 2, with a little Latin subtitle that says, bits are now missing, or something like that, that is a deliberate decision on Marlowe's part, probably, isn't it, to not go on after that point.
Possibly, and it's interesting in that sense, in terms of the audience of the poem and its sophistication, that Marlowe actually excludes the most famous bit of the story, which was that Hero would put a light in her tower, enabling Leander to guide himself across the Hellespont, which is about a mile's length, and swim across, and he would follow the light. And this is the key kind of, iconic bit of the hero and Leander story in Musaeus and in the Ovid versions, and everyone knows that that's what the story is about. But there is no mention of this light at all. They happen in the Chapman, of course, but not in the Marlowe bits. And in fact, he swims across the Hellespont at the end of the day, and he sees the sun setting on Hero's tower towards the end. But we ought to come onto the poem, which is amazing, written in heroic couplets or rhyming pentameter couplets, and its first lines may evoke other famous first lines. On Hellespont, guilty of true love's blood, in view and opposite two cities stood. Which surely goes into Romeo and Juliet, two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene.
It's a fantastic first line, isn't it? Because it introduces guilt, love, and blood, all in the first line. So this is not going to be a straightforward romance, whatever else is going to happen. Guilty of true love's blood. Why is the Hellespont guilty of true love's blood? Well, I suppose it's named after a character called Heles, isn't it, or Heles, who, with her brother, is escaping a poisonous stepmother. Her real mother has sent a golden ram to fly across this stretch of water, and for some reason, which I don't think is entirely clear, Heles falls off. So the mother's love in rescuing her child is then scuppered by the fact that she drowns anyway. And obviously the whole idea of drowning is in the back of everyone's mind when they start this poem, because the story of Hero and Leander was very, very well known at this point, wasn't it? And everyone beginning this poem would know that the terminal point of this poem was that at some point Leander was going to drown.
Leander drowns, and Hero throws herself out of her tower and kills herself. So the true love's blood can obviously be Hero and Leander's as well as that of Helle. Doesn't Neptune put a Helle's bracelet onto Leander as he's swimming across?
A bit later on in the poem, that's right. Which is rather a mixed blessing, considering what happened to her.
Yes, but we don't get the death of the lovers. We do get them coming together, and it is one of the most erotic poems in the language.
It is. It's deeply erotic, but it's also extremely funny, isn't it? And it's that, I suppose that's the Ovidian thing that you were getting at earlier on in the remarks that you were making. Okay, so let's go through the poem, as it were, chunk by chunk. The first bit is a wonderful, after that opening section that you just referred to, is a wonderful and brilliantly nuanced description of Hero, isn't it? Hero the fair. Someone, as he says, for men to gaze upon. And it's a wonderful portrait, isn't it, which is at once delightful, but also there's a tremendous sense of artifice about it, isn't there? So she has artificial flowers as part of her costume, where honeybees have sought in vain and beat from thence have lighted there again. So there's something sort of, in a way, exquisite and delightful, but also kind of fake about Hero as she's being presented in this opening portrait, perhaps.
It's her boots that I really can't get my head around. That her boots actually have buskins of shells that are all silvered, and they have coral, and they also have little sparrows perching to sip water out of the shells which are on her boots. It's hard to imagine unless you are thinking of a very kind of elaborate Renaissance portrait of a mythological figure, which is what Marlowe is creating, isn't it? It's extremely pictorial, and in this it relates to something like Venus and Adonis by Shakespeare, which was written the same year. They were both written probably, we can't be sure, in 1593, and one reason they were written was because the theatres were closed because of the plague.
Yeah.
So both Shakespeare and Marlowe had to turn their hands to other kinds of writing.
To do something with their left hand, as it were, in the closure of the theatres. Sparrows are interesting, aren't they? I remember from my A-level, Chaucer's Summoner, hot and lecherous as a sparrow. So if that's a common connotation of sparrows, that also feeds something into the portrait of Hero, which is interesting, isn't it? And I think it's a sort of a clue, isn't it, into the way that Marlowe works more generally. He's very, very good at insinuating things by just touching references or by allusions to classical myth that may look as if they're entirely formal, but actually if you look up the classical myth, you realise that he's actually implying something about the people that he's talking about.
Yeah, I think that suggests that the audience for this poem was a very sophisticated, classically trained audience. And as we've said, Marlowe, despite the poverty into which he was born, spent 6 years at Cambridge. He seems to have subsidised the last 3 years that he was there by his espionage activities. His bills in the buttery go up massively in this period.
Is that right?
Because, and that seems to be because he's been paid off. And in fact, there was an attempt at one point, it's thought he wouldn't get his MA because he might be under arrest. But there's a Privy Council note saying, no, leave Christopher Marlowe alone. He's doing good service to the country, whatever that was, whether it was attempting to infiltrate Catholic circles and act as an agent provocateur is possible. So in terms of the background of this poem, I think it is worth sort of framing this poem, which is amazingly elaborate and intricate and well patterned and knowing and clever and sophisticated, comes out of Marlowe the scholar in relation to the very murky, rather sordid demi-monde of spies and trading in secrets and betraying Catholics, in which Marlowe moved outside of the literary circles. And this was partly because he was taken up a little bit by Sir Thomas Walsingham, to whom the first edition was addressed posthumously, but by the publisher Blount. And Thomas Walsingham acted a little bit as a patron for Marlowe, it seems, in this last phase of his career. So it's sort of in that circle that this poem would have been first read and then copied out and handed around in manuscript.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. Click on the link in the description.